Hi, I'm Bob Santelli from the GRAMMY Museum, and you're tuned in to this week's Album Club. Now, for those of you here for the first time, let me tell you what Album Club is. It's basically a listening club. It's a book club without books. Last week, I introduced to you one of my favorite albums, the Wailers Catchafire from all the way back in 1973. 2 weeks before that, we discussed Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. Today, we're on the second tail end of the Wailers Catchafire. And for those of you who were with me last week, I gave you a little bit of homework. I asked you to listen to a couple of tracks, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. But before we do, let me just give you a little bit of a review from last week. I had mentioned last week that the Wailers Catchafire album was considered to be the first true reggae album, and certainly the first reggae album to cross over into rock audiences into the rock world. And there was a great story behind it. Bob Marley, the Wailers being Peter Tosh, Bunny Wailer, and the Barrett brothers, Carly Barrett on drums, Family Man Barrett on bass, they all went over to England to try and convince a Jamaican himself, Chris Blackwell, who owned Island Records and had on his label at the time bands like Traffic and King Crimson and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and others, that he should release an album of reggae music on a rock label and basically introduce reggae to a rock audience. Chris Blackwell was intrigued by that and decided to sign them. Listen in. I talked to Chris Blackwell last summer at the GRAMMY Museum, and he recalled how the album and his meeting with the band actually went down in London in the fall of 1972.
Chris, that's the 70s, of course, and Cat Stevens becomes a major star. But, man, it's really Bob Marley and the Wailers that simply take not just Jamaica, not just Europe, not just U.S., but the entire world. Becomes a world musician of incredible renown. Did you see that coming? Did you see the success that he had? Was that obvious to you that he could do what he did?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I met him and Peter and Bunny. I met them because they had got stranded in London. They'd been sent by their manager to do music for a film in Stockholm, but the film collapsed, and the manager had not given them had only given them their airfare back to London, and they wanted to get back to Jamaica. And again, just like the guy who called me, whose name I should certainly remember, with Steve Winwood, it was a similar situation. Somebody called me and said, Bob Marley and the Wailers, which at that time was just the three of them, Peter, Bunny, and Bob, stranded in London. Can you meet with them and see if there's something you do to get them there, get them back to Kingston? So it was 5 days later that somebody rang me and asked me if I wanted to see Bob Marley and the Wailers, and I said yes. I wouldn't have if that hadn't happened,
Yeah.
So when I met with them, I asked them, what was their plan, what they were doing, and they were saying they were trying to get a record on black radio in America. And this was 1972. And I told them, I said, actually, I didn't think you have a hope of that, of which all of them were a little taken aback. I shouldn't have said it quite like that, but it just came out. And two of them were very upset, and Peter and Bunny were very upset. And I was called Chris Whiteworth from then on. And I can't remember what Bunny called me, many things. And Bob said, Bob then said, what do you think? And I said, I think you should be a rock act. And that was really it. We talked a bit more. I can't remember what we talked about, but what I did was gave him, I think it was £5,000. £5,000 because it was in London, and he said, you know, what do we have to sign? I said, you don't need to sign anything, and just go and make a record, and I'll come out in a few months and see how it sounds.
That was Chris Blackwell, one of my heroes and certainly one of the most important figures in the history of reggae. So you see that the Wailers get signed, Chris gives them some money, they go back to Jamaica and cut a record that ultimately will be called Katchafire. Now you have to understand that even though Bob Marley, for rock and roll ears, sounded like a new artist, he first made his record back in 1962. He made a single called Judge Not. 1962, that's the year the Beatles break in. That's the year Bob Dylan comes out with his first album. So by 1973, Marley had been a veteran, and others in the Wailers had been veterans of the Jamaican music scene and making records in Jamaica. Not quite the way they would make them in the US or the UK. Clearly, the money wasn't there, the technology wasn't there. The records sound pretty cool today, but they were pretty primitive in terms of the way they were made. I'm shocked, really, that Chris gave them not only money to make the record and allowed them to make it by themselves, which was really an amazing thing for Chris to do. And of course, when he heard the tracks, he was shocked. He thought, wow, he came up with a record that he could release on a rock label that he felt would have great possibilities with rock and roll fans. And of course, he wasn't wrong. Okay, so let's talk about your homework. Remember, if you were with me last week, I asked you to listen to Katchafire a few times and then concentrate on 4 songs. Those songs were Slave Driver, Concrete Jungle, No More Trouble, and Bob Marley's classic love song, Stir It Up. So those are the 4 I want to talk about now and provide a little bit of insight for you so that when you go back and hear the record again, it'll be even more meaningful for you. So, as I had mentioned, this is a record, an album, Katchafire, that had some songs on it that had been written earlier and had been recorded in Jamaica earlier. And then what the Wailers did with Chris Blackwell's money is to basically go in and re-record the record and re-record some of these songs. So I guess we'll start with Stir It Up, because of all of the songs on Katchafire, Stir It Up is probably the most memorable. It's considered to be one of Bob Marley's greatest love songs, maybe his greatest actually. And it wasn't a song that he had written for the record. He actually wrote that way back in 1967, and he wrote it for his girlfriend, then wife, and then band member Rita Marley. Rita and Bob had grown up in Kingston, Jamaica, and from early on they were a couple. They were a pair, Rita being a singer herself, primarily influenced by people like Aretha Franklin and other soul singers out of the U.S. And Bob, of course, being influenced not just by reggae artists and other artists like ska artists, the Scotalites and others who were in Jamaica, but also American groups like the Impressions and James Brown and Sam Cooke and Otis Redding and others that he had listened to as a kid. Anyway, Stir It Up has some of maybe you might say cheesy lyrics, cheesy love song lyrics, but Bob is a young man, he's in love with Rita, and Stir It Up is the song that he always felt best represented his love for her back when they were young. So listen to that record again listen to that track, I should say, as a love song from Bob to Rita. Second song, I think, or the next 3 songs, I should say, that I think are really important, 2 of which are profound, powerful, revolutionary, actually. Before I get to those 2, let me just point out that song number 2 I asked you to listen to, No More Trouble, is a perfect example of what I was just saying. It's a song where you'll hear a lot of funk and soul, a lot of American musical roots, Black American musical roots in that song. And it shows, I think, how much Bob and Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer and the others looked upon American music as their not just form of inspiration, but education as well. So there's a deep connection in that song to American R&B, American soul, American funk, this new sound coming out of Black America in the early 1970s. So that's a song that you definitely want to concentrate on as well. But the final two songs, Concrete Jungle and Slave Driver, I think they're the reasons why I think that record, why I think Katchafire is such a great record, why it's held up as one of the great protest albums and revolutionary albums. You got to remember back in the late 60s when rock had embraced music as a form of political and social protest. You had the Stones writing Street Fighting Man. You had Jefferson Airplane writing Volunteers. You had all those great Dylan songs from the early and mid 60s dealing with the civil rights and oppression in America. Well, that, of course, in rock and roll starts to really diminish in the early 1970s. And it's really picked up by reggae artists, particularly Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer. On the album Katchafire, if you listen to Slave Driver, just think about that for a second. A song called Slave Driver. What does it deal with? Basically, it deals with the frustration, anger, horror that a black person in Jamaica had to deal with in terms of his or her history. This is a song that just castigates slavery. And I love the track here that, I love the lyric that says, slave driver, the table is turned, catch a fire and you're going to get burned. So it's a real slap at slavery, and it's a real condemnation of something that, of course, is horrible, not just in the Caribbean, or was, but we also here in America carry that stigma with us as well. I don't know if there's a better song that deals with issues of slavery and what it has meant, not just to people back in the day, but today, than Slave Driver. And the other song that I would highly recommend you pay more attention to is Concrete Jungle. It's, to me, is a powerful song simply because it's full of anger and it's full of truth. Bob Marley and members of the Wailers, including Rita, Peter, and Bunny, they all grew up in Kingston, which is the largest city, at least in the 1970s it was, maybe it still is, the largest city in the Caribbean, and probably one of the worst ghettos in all of the world. It's called Trenchtown. You may hear of Trenchtown in a future Bob Marley song called No Woman, No Cry. Anyway, they grow up in Trenchtown. I've been to Trenchtown. You don't go in there as a tourist. I went in actually with members back in the day when I was a music journalist and correspondent out of Jamaica. I got a tour of Trenchtown thanks to Toots Maytal. Toots and the Maytals, Toots Hibbett, who kind of drove me around there. He wanted me to get a feel as a white guy from the U.S. as to what a real ghetto was all about. And wow, it was pretty amazing. And Concrete Jungle is all about living in just that, a concrete jungle. It was a place where poverty ruled, where people basically lived on top of each other. And yet, despite all of that, there was this, I don't know, inner harmony or sense of pride and maybe even survival that comes out of not just the song Concrete Jungle, but the truth of being a Jamaican musician and actually rising above what Trenchtown represented and the daily survival tactics that you needed in order to come out of Trenchtown. So those are 4 songs. Again, the 4 that I would suggest: Stir It Up. And by the way, you might know Stir It Up because Johnny Nash, remember Johnny Nash? I Can See Clearly Now. He did a version of Stir It Up back in the early 1970s. And as a matter of fact, now that I think of it, No More Trouble. Erykah Badu actually did a version of that song. So you might know that song, if not from the Wailers, then maybe from Erykah Badu. I don't know if anyone's ever covered Slave Driver. They'd be crazy to, because I don't think you could improve on that one or Concrete Jungle. But I do know that in 1973, when that record comes out, it doesn't go crazy. It sells moderately well, but I can tell you that when the Wailers played in the spring, I think, of 1973 in London at a club called Speakeasy, if I'm not mistaken, Eric Clapton shows up, among other rock royalty, and Eric is blown away by reggae, and later on, of course, he'll cover another Bob Marley song called I Shot the Sheriff. And then later, when the Wailers come to the U.S., this is the concert or club show that I will forever regret not being at, because I could have. I lived there and I should have known. But it was when the Wailers opened up for Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band at a club in downtown New York called Max's Kansas City. Wow. What a show that must have been. There weren't a whole lot of people there, just a handful, because neither band had yet broken and neither artist had broken. But wow, what a show that would have been. After Katchafire, another album in the fall called Burnin', also by the Wailers. And then after that, we have a change in title. The band now becomes Bob Marley and the Wailers. Peter Tosh leaves to go on his own to create a very successful solo career. And Bunny Wailer, or Bunny Livingstone, as is his real name, he goes on to have a career as well. But neither can touch the power and passion of Bob Marley. And of course, the 1970s, there's no bigger artist in the world than Bob Marley when you include the third world. I was very fortunate because in the late 1970s, starting in 1978, I was a music critic and music journalist and living on the East Coast. And I took an assignment to go to Jamaica to cover the scene down there. I was very excited to do it and kind of a little frightened to do it too, because at the time there was a lot of political violence going on in the country in 1978. There was an assassination attempt just before that on Bob Marley. Fortunately, I wasn't there for that. But as much as I was totally intimidated by going into Kingston by myself and trying to get a story, it led me to a 2-decade-long relationship with Jamaica and reggae, and having the opportunity to tour with Bob and to do a number of interviews with him and really get an inside understanding of how this very, very important music form took shape. And it was a very different feeling listening to reggae music in Jamaica as it was in New York City, as I found out. But my love of reggae still is still strong, and my love of Katchafire is right up there with the very great albums in my life and the ones that I cherish the most. So that's Katchafire. Next week we will we'll go into the 60s this time, late 1960s, and we're going to talk about Led Zeppelin's debut album. So until then, this is Bob Santelli signing off from the coast of Oregon. You can see my rented house here on the coast of Oregon. This is the kitchen behind me. My wife didn't really want me to film here. She says those curtains are horrible. You didn't notice them, I'm sure. But anyway, I'm happy to share some time as we're all trying to get through this crisis of coronavirus, and hopefully this kind of album club reminisce of some great albums makes you feel a little bit better.